The jewelry was the last thing I catalogued. I had been working through my mother's estate in the methodical way I work through most things, room by room, shelf by shelf, the way a librarian goes through a donated collection that has arrived without an index. Eleanor Clough had lived in that house in Asheville for 51 years, and she had kept everything, not out of carelessness, but out of the deep and considered conviction that objects carry histories worth preserving. Her attic had boxes sorted by decade, labeled in her handwriting, with a black marker she kept specifically for that purpose. Her kitchen had a recipe box, in which she also kept receipts for items she considered significant. The linen closet had a fabric-covered notebook with a page for each major piece of furniture, describing when it was purchased, from whom, and for how much. She died in January, at 89, in her own bed, with her curtains open. It was before dawn, the azaleas were just starting to come in, and she had asked me, the evening before, to leave the window cracked so she could smell them if she woke. I sat with her through the night. She did not wake again, and the azaleas did come in, and by the time the hospice nurse arrived and the sky had gone from black to gray to the particular pale blue of an Asheville winter morning, the whole room smelled like something that was both an ending and not an ending at all. My name is Audrey Clough. I am 63 years old. I spent 35 years with the Buncombe County Library System, classroom librarian first, then branch librarian, then 11 years as director of the entire system before I retired 2 years ago. I tell people that working with books for 35 years teaches you a certain kind of orderliness, and this is true, but what it really teaches you is the discipline of the long record. Everything documented, everything retrievable, everything in its right place so that what is important can be found when it needs to be found. My husband Gerald, everyone who loved him called him Jerry, was a retired electrician who died of congestive heart failure 3 years ago. He was 67. We had been married 37 years, and he was a steady man, a dry and funny man, the kind of person whose particular way of standing in a doorway, and the particular way he held his coffee cup, and the particular sound he made when he was reading something that surprised him. These are the things that rearrange a room after someone is gone, not the large things but the small ones, the gestures that were too small to notice when they were present. I was born in Asheville and have lived in or near it my entire life. My mother's house is 20 minutes from mine, and in the 8 months since she died I have spent more time there than I have at home, working through the estate, sitting in her reading chair in the afternoon light, conducting a kind of ongoing conversation with her that I understand is one-sided and do not intend to stop. My sister Nadine is 60 years old. She lives in Charlotte, where she moved 22 years ago when she married Gordon Forsyth, who is an insurance adjuster and a man I have always found it difficult to describe without sounding unkind, so I will say only that he is someone who calculates before he commits to anything, which is a useful quality in an insurance adjuster and a more complicated one in a brother-in-law. Nadine and I grew up in the same house, under the same woman, with the same example set for us. We are different in the ways that two people who share everything formative and nothing else become different. Nadine is organized in a way that leans toward control. She has opinions about how things should be done and about whether the people around her are doing them correctly. She is not cruel. She is not dishonest, or at least I had believed she was not dishonest, for 60 years, which is a long time to carry a belief that turns out to need revising. We are not estranged. We were not particularly close. We are sisters in the particular mode of women who have a shared past and different presents, who love each other because that is what you do with family, and who keep a careful, civil distance because that is what you do when the alternative is exhausting. My mother's will was unambiguous. Eleanor Clough left the house and its contents to me. She left 3 specific pieces of furniture to Nadine, identified by description and location in the house: the secretary desk from the front parlor, the walnut mirror from the upstairs hallway, and the oak sideboard from the dining room. She left a set of china to be divided equally between us by mutual agreement. Everything else, the will stated, went to me. The jewelry collection was addressed in a separate paragraph. My mother had written it that way deliberately. Her attorney, a man named Raymond Finch who had handled her affairs for 30 years, told me afterward that she had been specific about wanting it separated from the general contents clause because she wanted the instruction to be unmistakable. The paragraph read, in part, I leave my jewelry collection, consisting of the items catalogued in the leather-bound appraisal folder stored in my sewing room, to my daughter Audrey in its entirety. I have wondered, since all of this happened, whether my mother knew something I did not, and whether she understood, in the particular way that elderly women sometimes understand the people they have raised better than those people understand themselves, that the separate paragraph was necessary. I do not know the answer. I know that the paragraph is there, and that it is unambiguous, and that my mother was a deliberate person who chose her words carefully. I should tell you something about the jewelry, because the jewelry matters to this story in a way that goes beyond its appraised value. My mother was not a woman of extravagant means. She ran an alterations shop for 23 years out of a converted garage behind the house, and before that, she sewed for neighbors and friends, and anyone who needed a hem taken up or a zipper replaced. The jewelry she collected was not inherited wealth. It was chosen, piece by piece, over 60 years, from estate sales and small shops and occasional gifts, each one selected because she found it beautiful or because it had a history she wanted to continue. She wore things. She did not collect them in the way of someone assembling an investment. She collected them in the way of someone who understood that a brooch from the 1940s had been someone's before it was hers, and would be someone else's after, and that the right response to that was to take good care of it in the meantime. The garnet brooch was the oldest piece, circa 1942, oval cluster setting in 14-karat gold. The pearl strand was the most personal. She'd bought it for herself the year she opened the alterations shop, as a marker of her professional life, and she wore it to every significant event for 50 years. The sapphire cocktail ring had a story she'd told me so many times I could recite it. Bought from an estate sale in 1979, from the estate of a school teacher named Harriet something, and my mother had decided Harriet would have approved of her having it, based entirely on the way the ring sat in the case, which she described as a ring that wanted to be worn by someone who wasn't afraid of it. 3 weeks after the funeral, I called a jewelry appraiser. His name was Vincent Farrell. I had found him through a recommendation from a colleague who had handled a similar estate, and I drove to his office with the mahogany box, green felt lining, brass clasp that has stuck since 1987, and sat across from him while he worked through each piece with a loop and a scale and a patience I recognized and respected. He photographed every piece from multiple angles before he touched it. He was there for 4 hours. At the end, he produced a written appraisal in a leather folder with laminated photographs of each item. 14 pieces, total insured value of $22,800. I keep the appraisal folder in the same drawer as my mother's will. I filed them together because they are, in effect, the same document. One says what belongs to me. The other says what it is worth and what it looks like. This decision, it turned out, was the most important thing I did in those early months. Nadine came to the house in March to collect her furniture. She drove up on a Saturday with Gordon and Brittany, their daughter, who is 34 and has Gordon's jaw and Nadine's certainty about everything. They arrived at 10 in the morning with a rented trailer and a system for loading that had clearly been discussed in the car on the way up, because each of them knew their role without being told. They had the secretary desk, the mirror, and the sideboard loaded and strapped down by noon. We had lunch. Nadine heated soup she had brought from Charlotte, which told me she had anticipated this being a longer day than it turned out to be. Brittany talked about her job. Gordon talked about traffic on the highway. We all talked around the fact that the house felt wrong in the particular way it still feels wrong every time I am in it, without my mother in the next room. At the end of the afternoon, after Brittany and Gordon had gone out to check the straps on the trailer, Nadine and I sat at the kitchen table with the last of the soup and the particular quiet that descends when a thing has been accomplished and there is nothing left to manage. She talked about the drive. She talked about how the secretary desk had fit in the trailer better than they'd expected. She mentioned, casually, that Brittany was thinking about moving to Charlotte, which Nadine said as though it was settled, though I had the sense Brittany was still deciding. And then the conversation shifted in the way conversations shift when someone has been working up to something and has decided the moment has come. Nadine stood and took her bowl to the sink, and on the way back she paused in the doorway of the sewing room, looking at my mother's work table, the pincushion still on it, the thread rack on the wall, the dressmaker's form in the corner, with the tape measure hanging from its shoulder. She stood there for a moment in a way that had the quality of remembering. Then she turned and asked if she could borrow the garnet brooch. "Just for the season," she said. "I have a gallery opening in April, and there's a charity dinner in May, and it would be so beautiful with what I'm planning to wear. You know how Mom always said it was meant to be worn." She smiled the particular smile she uses when she is asking for something she has already decided she is going to get. "I'll have it back to you by June." I said yes. I am going to tell you why I said yes, because I think the why matters. I said yes because I had documented the brooch thoroughly and believed the documentation was sufficient protection. I said yes because Nadine is my sister, and the brooch had belonged to our mother, and there was something in the asking, the mention of the gallery opening, the idea that the piece should be worn rather than sitting in a drawer, that felt like it was honoring our mother rather than dishonoring her. And I said yes because I am, at my fundamental core, someone who extends trust as a first position rather than a last one. 35 years of building a library community teaches you that most people are trustworthy most of the time, and that assuming otherwise costs you more than the occasional mistake corrects. It was an $1,100 mistake, measured by what the brooch was worth. Measured by everything else, it was considerably more. The gallery opening came and went. April turned to May. May turned to June. I texted Nadine in the second week of May, just checking in about the brooch. No rush, whenever you can get it back. She replied that it had been a busy stretch, and she hadn't forgotten. I said, of course. I said no rush again, because I meant it at the time. In June I texted again, more specifically, still thinking about getting the brooch back this summer. Would it work to drop it off when you're next in Asheville, or should I give you a mailing address? Nadine replied that Gordon had been dealing with something at work, and it had been a complicated few weeks, but she would figure out the logistics soon. I said I understood. I waited another 3 weeks. July came. I texted a third time, with more directness. "Nadine, I need to get the brooch back. Can we arrange a time, or I can give you a shipping address?" She did not reply for 4 days. When she did, the reply was short. "I'll look into it this week." She did not look into it that week. In July, I drove to my mother's house for a different reason, to finish packing the last of the books. And while I was there, I looked at the mahogany box on the dresser and thought about the brooch, and about my sister, and about the particular quality of a July that contains neither the piece nor an explanation for its absence. I picked up the box and looked at the 12 remaining pieces inside it. I put it back down. I did not do anything else with the feeling. I was aware, by this point, that something was wrong, but the specific shape of what was wrong was not yet visible to me. I was working with an explanation that made sense from the information I had. My sister was disorganized, distracted, dealing with whatever Gordon was dealing with, and the brooch was somewhere in her house and would be returned when she got to it. This was not the most flattering interpretation of her behavior, but it was an ordinary and human one. People are forgetful. People procrastinate. People mean to return things and don't. On a Wednesday morning in mid-July, my friend Celeste called me from across town. Celeste has been my friend for 28 years. She worked in the county assessor's office for most of her career, and she has the manner of someone accustomed to reading documents carefully and reporting what they say without embellishment. She does not call to speculate. She does not raise alarms about things she is not certain of. She called to tell me she was standing in front of a glass display case at an estate auction house on the north side of Asheville, and she believed she was looking at my mother's garnet brooch. I asked her to describe it. She described it in the methodical way she describes everything: the gold setting, the oval cluster of garnets in graduated sizes, the small chip in the lower left stone that my mother had called a character mark and refused to have repaired, the style of the safety clasp. She matched every detail I could verify from memory against Vincent Farrell's photographs. I asked her to stay where she was and not to touch anything. I sat down. I want to be exact about what those next few minutes felt like. There was a moment, very brief, maybe 30 seconds, where I simply did not believe it. Not because the evidence was unclear, but because the conclusion it pointed to was one that required me to rewrite something I had believed about my sister for 60 years. And 60-year-old beliefs do not dissolve in 30 seconds, even when the evidence is unambiguous. And then the 30 seconds passed, and the belief revised itself, and what replaced it was not anger, not then. Anger came later, in smaller quantities than I expected, but something quieter and more total, a form of understanding that I wished I had been wrong about. I called the auction house. I explained that I had reason to believe an item in their consignment inventory had been submitted without the knowledge or consent of its legal owner, and that I had notarized documentation of provenance. The woman I spoke to was careful and professional. She said she would hold the item pending verification and asked me to come in with documentation as soon as possible. I drove there that afternoon with the appraisal folder and my mother's will and Vincent Farrell's contact number written on a card. The brooch matched every detail in the appraisal photograph. The auction house confirmed it without question and transferred custody back to me while we worked through the paperwork. Before I left, I asked, because I am a librarian, and librarians ask the follow-up question, whether there were any other pieces from the same estate currently in their inventory. The woman went into the back. She came out with an expression that told me the answer before she spoke. The pearl strand. Double cultured, appraised at $2,400, submitted by the same consignor 2 weeks before the brooch. Already sold. I drove home with the brooch in the appraisal folder and sat in my mother's reading chair for a long time without turning on a light. I want to tell you something about what it is like to sit in a chair that belonged to someone you loved, in a room that still smells faintly like them, holding an object that was theirs, after learning what I had just learned. It is not a dramatic feeling. It is a quiet one. It has the quality of arithmetic, not anger yet, not grief exactly, but the process of adding up numbers that you kept hoping would stop adding before they reach the total they are reaching. You want the sum to be different. The sum is what it is. My mother had been meticulous because meticulous was what she could control in a life where a great many things were not controllable. She had documented because documentation outlasts the person doing the documenting. She had kept records because records are the thing that remain when memory is unreliable and good faith has been exhausted. I had inherited all of those habits without knowing I was inheriting them. Sitting in her chair in the dark, I understood for the first time why she had built them into the architecture of everything she cared about. The pearl strand had a history I knew well. My mother had bought it in 1971, the year she opened the alterations shop, as a mark of what she called her professional self, the self that existed apart from her marriage, her children, her house. She had worn it to every significant occasion for 50 years. It was in every photograph from every important moment of her adult life. In my mind, it was the piece most connected to who she was, not as someone's mother or wife or grandmother, but as herself. It was gone, sold to someone I would never identify, for a fraction of what it was worth, without my knowledge, without my consent, by my sister. I called Barbara Kuhn. Barbara has been my attorney since the estate opened. She is deliberate and direct, and she has the quality I most want in someone handling legal matters on my behalf, which is the quality of not being surprised by things that should not surprise her. I told her everything from the beginning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You have the will, the appraisal, and provenance documentation from the auction house itself. The consignor information will be part of their records." "This is very clear, Audrey." She said she would send a formal notice to Nadine and Gordon by the end of the week. I asked about the pearl strand. She said there were legal remedies, and she would address them through the formal process. She said not to contact Nadine directly while this was in progress. I said I understood. I went home, and I opened the mahogany box on my mother's dresser, and I counted what was inside. 12 pieces. The brooch was now back. The pearl strand was not there. 12 things that were mine, and one thing that was mine that I would not be seeing again, at least not in the form I had expected. Nadine called on Saturday, 2 days after Barbara's notice arrived. I did not answer. She called again Sunday morning. I did not answer. She texted, "Audrey, I need to explain. Then, I was going to pay you back. I didn't think it would be a big deal. Please call me." Then, later that afternoon, Gordon says I need to talk to a lawyer. "I don't understand why you're making this into what it is." I read all of these texts in the order they arrived. I did not reply to any of them. I am going to tell you something about why I chose silence, because I think it is worth being honest about. It was not cruelty. It was not punishment. It was the recognition that the conversation Nadine wanted to have, the explanatory conversation, the context-giving conversation, the conversation in which she explains what she meant, and I explain what it meant to me, and we find our way to something. That conversation had already become a legal matter, and legal matters proceed most cleanly without informal conversation running alongside them and complicating the record. But it was also this. I could not, at that moment, speak to her without the full weight of 60 years of revised understanding in the room with us, and that weight was not something I trusted myself to carry in a phone call. Some things require more space than a phone allows. Barbara handled everything that needed to be handled. I received updates from her by email, brief and factual, at the relevant stages, when notice was served, when Gordon's attorney responded, when the matter of the pearl strand reached a specific stage of resolution. I did not have to do anything except read the emails and confirm, each time, that I understood the next step and that I wanted to continue. I did, each time, want to continue. The process took 6 weeks, and the resolution was documented and final, and I will not go into the specific terms because they are private. What I will say is that it was final in both the legal and the personal sense, meaning not only that the matter was closed, but that my understanding of what had happened was complete, and I was not waiting for any further information that would change my understanding of it. Nadine and I have not spoken since August. I do not know whether we will again. I have sat with that question on many occasions, and I have not arrived at an answer, because it is not a question with an answer yet. It is a question that belongs to future circumstances I cannot predict, involving a version of my sister I have not yet encountered, and a version of myself that does not yet exist. What I can say is that I am not waiting for the phone to ring, and I am not drafting the conversation in my head. I am here, in the present, in the information I actually have. I am 63 years old, and I am not someone who makes dramatic pronouncements about the future. I am someone who lives in the present, with the information I actually have. And what I actually have is this. My sister took things that belonged to me, things that belonged to our mother, before they belonged to me, without asking and without telling me, and when she was found out, the first word she used was explain, and the second word was big deal, and those two choices of words tell me something true about how she understood what she had done. The mahogany box is on my own dresser now. I moved it there when everything was resolved, because it belongs somewhere I can see it, in a house where it will be looked after. The green felt lining has a small stain near the left hinge from a spill that was cleaned as well as could be managed 40 years ago. 12 pieces, each with a laminated photograph in the appraisal folder that lives in the same drawer as my mother's will. I think about my mother when I open that box. I think about the 60 years she spent assembling it, one piece at a time, from shop owners and estate sales, and one or two gifts from my father before he died, and the care with which she kept the receipts in her recipe box and the appraisal folder in her sewing room. She documented everything because she was meticulous. I documented everything because I learned from her. In the end, those were not two separate habits. They were the same habit, passed from one pair of hands to another, arriving finally at a moment when they were needed. The azaleas outside her house are going to be spectacular this spring. I have been tending them since January, pruning back the dead growth after the frost, working in the slow-release fertilizer she swore by, which I found in a coffee can in the potting shed with a label in her handwriting that said simply, Azaleas/March. I follow her label because I trust her record-keeping more than I trust my own intuition about when azaleas need feeding, which is, I have come to understand, the most appropriate possible tribute to her. I do not know who will tend them after me. I know that someone will, eventually, and I know that the plant does not require continuity of care from the same hands in order to bloom. It requires the right conditions and the right attention at the right time, and then it does what it was designed to do regardless of who is watching. That seems right to me. Some things bloom because of who tended them, and some things bloom in spite of everything, and from the outside you often cannot tell the difference. Someone needs to keep tending, and it turns out that person is me. I have thought a great deal, in the months since this resolved, about what to say to someone who finds themselves responsible for something irreplaceable, a collection, an heirloom, a promise, a piece of someone else's life that has been left in your care. And what I would say is this: documentation is not distrust. Keeping a record of what you hold, and what it is worth, and where it came from, and what it looks like, these are not acts of suspicion. They are acts of stewardship. They say, this matters, and I am treating it with the seriousness it deserves. My mother taught me this. She taught me without intending to teach me, by simply doing it herself for 60 years, in a house full of things she considered worth preserving and worth passing on correctly. I inherited her habits alongside her collection. I did not know, at the time, that I was inheriting the only thing that could protect it. If something in this story stayed with you, something about what we carry for the people we lose, or what we discover about the people we thought we knew, or the quiet work of protecting something that cannot protect itself, I would love to hear from you in the comments. These things are not simple and not clean, and you know that. This story is a work of fiction, written for reflection and entertainment. Any names, characters, and situations are the product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real people or actual events is entirely coincidental.